Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to talk about the State of Preservation Evoker number 2. It's been a bit since we've actually made another video about Evoker, and partially it's because of the fact that there really has not been a lot of massive changes or a lot of shakeup as I was actually hoping for with the spec since it really came out for testing. We've had a couple different adjustments, a couple new talents, but I personally was really expecting to see a lot more variety and even some more communication from the developers as to their intentions for the spec and their ideas. And to date, that really hasn't happened, so I wanted to make another video before they probably just change everything on Tuesday or Wednesday and invalidate all this, right? Now, going into it, there is a lot of concern about the range of the 25-yard healer and everything like that. That was the big thing. Oh, it's a 25-yard healer, but you get way ridiculous amounts of mobility to be able to compensate. Whether it's your strafe runs with like Dragonflight and Deep Breath, where you kind of just strafe the ground in front of you and you can recall back to your original position, or you can keep your later position if you want. You've got your dash, which will also allow you to cast on the move with hover. If you're not moving in any direction, you can just hover while standing still, and then it'll just empower you to cast on the move after that. So that way you're not always being forced to dash. And then you have rescue, which will be allowing you to jump to a target, heal them. And there's a number of different synergies with that, whether it's with Dream Breath or Life Bind. Dream Breath is just your big AoE that gets empowered by rescuing a target. And Life Bind also is kind of like a quick beacon almost, where you're able to replicate healing done to yourself onto the other target and vice versa. You also have the ultimate troll ability in Fly With Me, where you're able to pick somebody up and move them around. Through my testing, I was finding that it wasn't interrupting some of the spell casting, but I don't know if that was usual spells that you could like always cast on the move. But I also found that you could min-max it pretty decently if you get good at it, to be able to like barely move a tank player or barely move a DPS player so that they're not really going to be hindered too much. My tank complaints and everything when I was using Fly With Me on them were very minimal, and it's honestly kind of convenient because you're so quick and able to run ahead of the pack, so you can kind of like drag the tank to the next pack in a lot of instances. Now, all of this mobility, I believe, since we don't really know for sure, but I believe is because of the fact that you have such a reduced radius. So it is intended for you to be jumping and flying and zipping all over the place, which puts emphasis and more skill into knowing where everybody's standing, knowing how to position yourself, know how to be able to flip and jump and do whatever to be able to get where you need to be without dying to mechanics. As a result, it feels like the healing side of it is a lot more simplistic, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we'll talk about that in the next chapter if you want to check below. We'll talk more about that, where I think there are some problems going into it. But I believe that the range for Preservation Evoker is not actually the key problem with the spec, even though it's going to be the very first thing that people are jumping on and advocating to fix and change and all of that. I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe that if they were to actually make changes to the 40-yard range of Evoker, or to make it a 40-yard range, they would also consequently nerf the mobility in a couple different ways. So whether it is only allowing one charge of hover, or whether it's increasing the rescue cooldown, or Fly With Me cooldown, or whatever it is. I believe that would be a key sort of like tuning knob that they would want to adjust so that the spec is not so crazy mobile, more so than any other class in the game. Okay, we'll see. But my belief is that the range and mobility are very much tied together, and so I think there's a lot of other things that they need to be making adjustments on, and a lot of other problems for the spec first when it comes to how they play and how they operate that are not actually tied to their range or mobility. That being said, it's all about how you're healing these boss fights and dungeon pulls and everything. While we haven't actually had any raid testing yet, hopefully we'll have some soon. The biggest thing that I've actually noticed while playing Evoker is your ability to heal targets that are not clumped together is incredibly poor. If people are stacked, you're in great shape. You can Emerald Blossom until, you know, the world ends and trumpet sound. You have so much capability to be able to blast tons of blossoms and blast tons of healing as a result. But when you start having players off at range, yeah, there's the range requirement of having to move to them, but I don't think that's the key issue. I can hover and life bind and get to them and then jump back into position. I could grab them with fly with me and bring them into position if I needed to. I have a lot of resources to be able to actually get there. That's the point of Evoker. The issue is your ability to put together sustained output over a long period of time. And that's something in a 5-man environment that Evoker can kind of struggle with because they're resource bound. They, like Holy Paladins, have their own resource. They have Essence, which you can actually get to stack up to 6 if you talent into it. And once I did so, it just became miles more consistent to be able to pump the output when I needed it. But I also found a lot of times where I was just kind of running dry on Essence, and then my output just stopped. Because having to spam Living Flame, which is kind of like a smite and a flash heal, depending on who you target, it can damage or heal. It's also the only way that you get Essence Burst, which gives you your next ability free, as in it costs no essence. So with that, it was a bit of inconsistency because there is the issue at hand of trying to make sure I have enough essence and not burn through it, and then I'm just not getting Essence Burst procs, or it's too slow to be actually casting Living Flame, and then you start running into a whole heap of problems after that in order to actually survive. With that, it's trying to find that sort of like right balance in terms of the 5-man healing, and I'm more concerned about it when it comes to a raiding environment because there's a lot of fights, we saw it in Sepulcher for example, that require lots and lots of movement and spread healing all over the place. You probably do pretty fine when it comes to something like Anduin, where you just perma heal upstairs, because that's what Mistweaver did, and even Dispriest, although unrelated, but that's what Mistweaver did, which is kind of a close cousin to Preservation Evoker in the type of output that is presented. You're able to have less hots, less trickle healing, but it's all it's kind of like bursty and stacked. So it's a little bit of a cousin, I would say, to where Mistweaver is at, where they like to have a nice steady output of healing onto everybody all the time, especially if they're close by as needed. And with that, Preservation Evoker could do really well for healing like Anduin Befouled Barriers or something. But if you're trying to have an encounter like Halandris, you could argue, oh man, the range requirement would be a problem because of how spread and how difficult it is to be able to reach everybody. To which I would say your movement's kind of made for a fight like that. But how to actually heal them efficiently is the massive problem that I would argue. You have a really good tool in Spirit Bloom, which is kind of like a chain heal, but it heals everybody equally. That is on a 15 or 30 second cooldown, depending on how you talent it. And that can be pretty good. Dream Breath's range is, I believe, around 30-ish yards. I think it's a little larger than your 25-yard range, but it is a very wide cone, so you have to make sure you're positioning yourself sort of like behind everybody, and then you're able to breathe on them. And that can cause problems as well when people are spread out to the 4 winds. And if you wanted to be able to get some more Living Flame casts, you have to charge up your Fire Breath all the way to be able to get the max essence stack, so you have like the Living Flame cleave. It can be really efficient output, which is why you'd probably want to do it, right? Of building up your Living Flame to max stacks, building up your Fire Breath to max stacks, hitting a Living Flame heal, and then it'll cleave heal like 4 or 5 targets. It's really good output, but requiring you to root yourself in place, diminishing the value of your mobility to be able to get that cast off, which could be like 4 or 5 seconds of channeling or charging up before you can release, becomes quite a bit of a problem. And that's kind of the issue at hand with the Empower spells in general, is that they can be really efficient, they can be really good to utilize, but it's incredibly difficult to be able to just get everybody positioned correctly, and you have other mechanics going on, and you have to make sure nothing's happening to you, nothing's happening to other people that they're going to walk out of your range. If people are stacked, it's the easiest thing in the world. If they're spread, it's a nightmare. And so these Empower spells are actually more of a hindrance, I would say, to an Evoker playstyle than anything else. This fluid, light, agile dragon has to just sit there rooted in place in order to be able to get the cast off. It makes it very, very difficult to be able to work with. And honestly, I think that one of the big changes needed for Evoker is to make these Empower spells castable while on the move if you're under the effect of hover, I think. because having to like make any sort of last minute adjustments, or if there's movement mechanics, yeah, you can always cancel early, and you might do that in a lot of cases just because of how mechanics are working, but you start to quickly notice the fall off or drop off if you're having to cut your channels too quickly, or you have to cut your empowers a little bit too quickly in a lot of situations. For instance, for like Spirit Bloom, it's the difference between healing an extra target or two. For Dream Breath, it's not as big of a deal because it's just reducing your cooldown and reducing a little bit of output. So actually in dungeons, I was using a lot of like 1-stack empowers to be able to get as much healing out as I could, and that worked out great. But with something like Spirit Bloom in a raid, you probably are going to be casting that about on cooldown, just to be able to get either the essence regen or just the efficiency of the cast as it stands, because they just recently buffed it by like 30-something%. So it's definitely going to be one of those buttons you just slam on cooldown all the time whatsoever. Similarly, I think with the Fire Breath, just because it's cheap and it goes into the Living Flame Cleave like we just talked about, you're really reliant on mixing in these empower spells very frequently when you go into a raiding environment, and if they're making you root yourself in place as a result of this, it undercuts what I think is the real flavor of the class, and that's something that they really need to be able to fix and adjust and all of that. Now, one of the things I haven't mentioned at this point in the video is Echo. Echo is an interesting ability. It's a wonderful ability, allowing you to replicate 1 heal on a target. It also costs essence, which means it's competing with your Emerald Blossom. And so it's costing 2 essence instead of the 3 or 4 that you're getting out of Emerald Blossom. So you're able to cast quite a few echoes, especially if you're building up essence bursts. The problem is, it's only replicating 1 heal, and it's replicating the very next heal that you cast, which means if you are trying to apply a lot of echoes, like one of the things I've heard a lot of people talk about is applying a lot of echoes, whether it's by consuming essence or casting Temporal Anomaly, which is kind of like this slow bronze ball that you send out, which you can talent into to apply echoes to targets. You can do that and like life bind and set up big Spirit Blooms and hit the whole raid with them, but there's just a lot of extra work that starts going into those kind of things. I've seen some builds where you're able to like stasis a bunch of Temporal Anomalies and then flip them all out again and spread echo to everybody in the raid and then Spirit Bloom, but you can't cast literally any other heal to be able to do it. It's like a jankier disc ramp, which is also like worse than a disc ramp. And again, you're just so hard committed to this that you can't stop what you're doing. Otherwise, you just completely like destroy it. You're like, oh, I cast Reversion, your healing over time effect. Oh, I just applied Reversion to everybody with Echo on it, and then it's destroyed. So the more complicated builds that you see when people are trying to cook them up or talk about what's good with Evoker, in my opinion, the more complicated a build is to be able to pull off, more strict its cast sequence and complex that it is, probably the worse that it is. Discipline, on the other hand, has a fairly straightforward sort of split between I'm applying atonements and doing nothing but applying atonements. Now I'm DPSing to get value out of the atonements. And it's like, you go from one stage to the other stage, and that's it. Having to sort of have this like jump back and forth with stasis and all the other abilities seems very odd, and it also sort of falls under the same sort of issue that an Emerald Blossom type setup has in, if you want to be able to apply all these echoes, you need people to be decently stacked together to be able to be hit by all the temporal anomalies. So again, if players are all spread out, you're going to hit less targets with the anomalies. Temporal anomaly costs quite a bit of mana still, and you're still going to have the same issue that you had previously. The last video I had about Echo and Evoker was talking about how Spirit Bloom would replicate those heals. They've since removed that, which is unfortunate. I really wish that they would have made some kind of adjustment to it so it allowed some sort of additional cleave, because I think that was one of the better ways to be able to fix up the spec for ranged healing, even if it was an inferior build, or even if they would make it an inferior build, similar to how like Primordial Wave is not always going to be like your bread and butter, for example, with the Restoration Shaman. A lot of times there's a lot of really efficient stacked abilities like Wellspring, which have been used forever and ever and been great efficient heals, but they're more complicated to use if people aren't stacked, so you have other options to sort of fill the gap. And what I'm saying is, I don't want Evoker to just be the best spread healer that you've ever seen in the world, but it seems right now that there's a very distinct hole in the spec that they don't have their primordial wave. They don't have their extra sort of resource on hand to be able to fill in this gap that exists in their spec, unless Blizzard starts adding it to the game, because it's just not there at the moment. So it's more along the lines of a spec will not be optimal in this environment, but they at least have something to deal with it. And I'm worried that at the moment, Echo doesn't exactly fill in that niche for it. And if anything, it seems almost like talents like Ouroboros, which is a new one, where your Emerald Blossom heals will just increase the healing of your next direct Echo Hot, or Echo Direct Heal. And those don't really work that well either. I played with it in dungeons, and every once in a while I get a fat heal on my tank, and then like that's about it, and then the counter resets all over again. It's like, for an N tier talent, it doesn't seem to be as helpful or as good. So now we can get into some of the suggestions that I've kind of been putting throughout the video, and we'll summarize them and talk about them quite a bit. First and foremost, I do think they need to do something about the Empower spells, because they undercut the flavor of the spec in terms of its mobility and agility and power, really. They need to be able to make it either so that haste is reducing the Empower cast time by a larger amount. There's a temporal compression, which is the passive where your bronze spells reduce the Empower time for your casts. Maybe that could be made quite a lot stronger, or maybe it could just stack higher. I'm not sure. Those two, I think, would help tremendously. When it comes to the talents, I firmly believe there needs to be a talent revamp particularly in the temporal anomaly field, because having this orb which is spewing out echoes to targets or heals or shields or whatever on a 5-second cooldown that costs a massive amount of mana just seems like a recipe for disaster. We've seen how ridiculous Mistweaver can be over the years when they just sort of have like no limit on how much they can just spew output if they have enough targets for it. You know, we saw in like Castle Nathria where the Kael'thas fight, you could build Mistweaver just to be this massive single target healer, and they did a great job. But it cost like their entire mana bar, but you just innervated them. And those things I think are extremely silly from a class design perspective, that a healer can do infinite healing with no real sort of like drop off, as long as they just keep getting fed mana over and over and over. Not a huge fan of how that works. I mean, Mistweaver's not the only culprit. Disc was like that in very early Legion when Radiance didn't have a cooldown. There's a number of examples that have happened over the years. I don't want Preservation Evoker to be in that same ship where it's like, well, gosh, I need the Innervate in order to actually perform. Those kind of things are just going off to a bad start. Essence, I think the spec is incredibly tied to its essence, to the point where I think that you take every single essence boost, whether it's essence regen off Spirit Bloom, whether it's essence off the class tree, an extra 6th piece of essence that you get from your talent tree, all of that. I think that you just take all of those things possible because the spec is so massively tied to it. My suggestion for that, I'd really like to see more options, probably in the class tree, but I don't know how Devastation works. Maybe in a class tree for something like a Blood Tap, where you're able to build up charges of extra essence that you can use on demand. That way you can sort of store them for a moment of need if you really, really do need that just like one extra essence to be able to get your cast off. I think that could go a little bit, as well as something to further accelerate your Living Flame. Because like I mentioned before, when your tank is just getting brutalized, or anybody in your raid is getting brutalized and you need to actually spot heal, Evoker is incredibly poor at doing so. And that doesn't bode well for a dungeon environment where you're the only healer and nobody else can really help you out. So something along those lines to be able to fix up Living Flame, or make it a little bit more spammable or more friendly, or just have other abilities that can be more focused in terms of their output. At the moment, if you look at the talent tree for Evoker, it seems very much suited towards Raid, with Raid as the ultimate idea, and that's just about it. When it comes to dungeons, I'm pretty consistently just trying to like run all over the place and do everything possible to keep people alive with what feels like a very inferior kit compared to the other healers. Your damage and healing and everything is fun if you can get tight hallways like Neltharis or Tearhold. There's a couple other dungeons like that. It can be pretty easy to stack everybody into your blossoms. I like the reversion gameplay and everything like that, but it's not going to top people off on their own. And so I feel very much like Evoker is missing a button or two. And maybe part of that is because they wanted to keep the spec very simple, like I said at the beginning of the video, so that they're able to play around more of the mobility and flying all over the place as the complexity for the spec, rather than have some super challenging healer and everything like that in terms of his gameplay. I guess. I can only really theorize. So I think at this point, Evoker has kind of fallen off a lot in the hype for me, and it feels that way from a lot of other creators I've talked to as well, in big part because the lack of changes that Blizzard has put forth, and really the lack of extra communication at this point. I'm really hopeful that we start getting some more blue posts or some more conversations about it to be able to start bringing up the spec, because raid testing has got to be right around the corner, and if there's any encounters where you're spreading out all over the place, I don't think you have any reason to bring an Evoker, and I think any Evoker main hopeful is just going to feel terrible playing their spec on certain boss encounters. Now, I don't think a Shaman is going to be a super big fan of healing Halandris, obviously, but at least they had something to be able to fill the gap a little bit. And that's really what I'd like to see for Evoker, is something to fill the gap on long range and spread output healing. Less about the range, more about the type of output, I should say. Maybe they're going to have to make the adjustment to allow Evoker to heal from 40 yards away, but I think it's going to come at the cost of the mobility, and I think that they need to make a lot more adjustments and a lot more iterations to see if it's possible for the spec to maintain its mobility, maintain the range requirement, but still be able to have some sort of split, cleave, AoE, spread healing that can go into the mix when players are not stacked perfectly for their blossoms. So otherwise, let me know what you guys think. If you have any other interactions or builds that you guys would like me to try out, be sure to link them in the comments below or in our Discord in the Dragonflight beta section. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.